Hey everyone, and welcome back to another Game Industry Report. So, once again, the actions of EA games are being called into question, and it really does spawn off a very interesting topic about video game development. However, this time, it's not something from a consumer perspective, it is from a developer perspective. EA are somewhat notorious for mishandling their development studios, and that has led to a high number of really high-profile studios being closed. Most recently, of course, Visceral Games, who were closed after the failure of Project Ragtag, which really is the starting off point for today's video, because there has been an interview with Ragtag's project lead. The EA graveyard, though, is quite a bit larger. We've got Maxis, we've got EA Salt Lake, Mythic Games, Victory Games, Phenomic, DreamWorks Interactive, Black Box Games, Playfish, Pandemic Studios, NewFX, Origin Systems, and then, of course, Westwood and Bullfrog. Really, those last three being kind of real old school ones. Now, those closures, many of them were quite a while ago, but it's a history that's not been forgotten. More recently, though, we've seen a number of EA projects run into trouble. And it seems like there's one fairly large problem connecting all of them, and that is the company-wide enforcement of the Frostbite 3 engine. Now, this has led to massive problems at Bioware and is partially responsible for the failure of Project Ragtag, and realistically, it has very likely been the source of many other internal development woes that we right now just don't really know about. Now, what is a game engine? A game engine is really the core of what a game is built on. You have to have the core architecture of the engine, and then you have tools and systems that kind of bolt onto that in a way. Now, much of my programming degree was focused on game engines. My personal area of interest was graphics programming. I wrote a renderer, and I regularly work in the Unity engine for my company. So I do know a fair bit about how game engines work, meaning this is a very interesting topic to me personally. Now, building an engine takes a lot of time and resources, and having a powerful engine that provides a company with a more tailored solution for their games, and that could give them a competitive advantage when it comes to their ability to actually make games. Now, many larger studios will have their own custom engines tailored to their own needs, like the Anvil Next 2.0 engine, which has allowed Ubisoft to make games like Assassin's Creed Origins and Assassin's Creed Odyssey within a very short time frame. Now, the dream scenario is using one engine across your whole company, such that all of your teams can help each other out with projects, and such that the tools that you use can be built once and reused many times across your teams, rather than having every game project have to develop its own tools and own little bolt-on systems from scratch. Now, this is where we come to EA Games. So, looking at many of their titles and many of the developers that they would come to own, well, Dead Space, I believe, was made in a custom engine. Mass Effect was made on Unreal 3, a pretty customized version. Battlefield was made in Frostbite 1 and Frostbite 2. Now, all of these engines ended up being highly tailored to the game projects that they were being used on, or, with the Unreal stuff, they were sort of built on top of a very well-known and customizable engine like Unreal 3, and of course, the modern Unreal 4 and Unity are both examples of highly flexible and customizable game engines. So EA had this problem. They probably did not want to license another engine like Unreal 4, so instead they decided to look at their internal teams and use one of the engines they already had across the company. And the goal makes sense. You have every team use the same technology, and then you have any technology made by any one team be able to be used by your other teams. And as much as it is fun to rag on companies, I think we can all agree that that is a pretty reasonable goal to shoot for. The problem, of course, though, is how they did it and how it impacted many of their projects. So, looking at their teams, well, they identified DICE's Frostbite engine as their solution. Now, when you look at Frostbite first games like Battlefield, like Battlefront, they're visually stunning, and they often run shockingly well for the visuals that they're able to spit out, at least, barring maybe some tech problems that those games sometimes have on launch, and people who have unbalanced systems in terms of their build. So the engine was designed for DICE's first-person shooter games, and that meant that it really was quite specific. So, great for your first-person shooter gameplay, amazing renderer, but it's quite clear that it was not a generic engine at that stage. It was a tailored solution meant to meet the needs of DICE. So when EA had made the decision to have Frostbite 3 be their standardized game engine across the org, they really, they didn't just make it so it was for all future projects. They actually pivoted currently in development projects to use that tech. And looking at the timelines, it seems like this mostly did impact games that were not in full production yet. So I think you can see why they maybe thought that was an okay move at the time. The thing is, we essentially do know that this caused chaos across multiple studios, and today in this video we're going to be focusing on Bioware and Visceral Games. with both studios' Frostbite 3 related struggles being quite well documented, and Visceral's Amy Hennig, her recent interview on Project Ragtag. Of course, she's of Naughty Dog fame, being one of the minds behind the Uncharted series, so an extremely notable figure in our industry. And you know what? She says it best. So basically, here is what she said about the development process of Ragtag. What that meant is we obviously had to take the Frostbite engine because there was an internal initiative to make sure everyone was on the same technology, but it was an engine that was made to do first-person shooters, not third-person traversal cinematic games. So building all of that third-person platforming and climbing and cover taking and all that stuff into an engine that wasn't made to do that, we did a lot of foundational work that I think the teams are still benefiting from because it's a shared engine, but it's tough when you spend a lot of time doing foundational stuff, but then you don't get to go, ta-da, here's a game. Okay, so you know what? I can really empathize with this from my personal experience. Why? Because it cost me a significant amount of money making this mistake. Our game development efforts are going very well now, but at one point we sunk basically £15,000 into a failed project, and we actually developed some really cool tech that's very useful, but the problem is that we only really got to iterate on the design after the tech was in place. Now, doing a project like that in the indie scale that we were at was a thoroughly stupid idea. Of course, that's tech that will be really useful in the future for us, but it was really frustrating. We were sitting around building all these tools, all this cool stuff, but we weren't actually iterating on the thing that matters, the gameplay. Now, Amy, of course, is working on a far larger scale, far larger. But what is apparent is that Frostbite really was the Battlefield first-person engine, when Visceral could have been working ahead on gameplay, i.e. the thing that would have made Ragtag unique. They instead had to sink a lot of engineering time into getting the fundamentals in, like a robust third-person camera system and cover system, stuff like that. The animation, even things like the animation systems needed for that type of movement. For a super polish-heavy game that she was trying to make, that would have been a massive development hurdle, something that likely would not have been as much of a problem if they were working on something like Unreal 4 that was more designed to be worked with in that way. And that led to progress being slow in Ragtag, and ultimately it prevented them from iterating on the core gameplay, and of course we all know how that project ended up. Then Bioware were also hit hard by this, with some of their woes almost being like a dark comedy. At one time, Bioware had 3 planned projects: Dragon Age Inquisition, Mass Effect Andromeda, and Shadow Realms. All of these were third-person action RPGs of one variety or another, and they all had different types of gameplay. Now, the Frostbite requirement hit all of these projects, heavily impacting their development process. Remember, this is something that happened to a studio who I don't think were really used to building their own tech. Like, they were using a pretty heavily iterated on version of Unreal 3, and this is speculation on my side, but they were mostly, I think, were using Unreal 3, some custom tools, and other plugins, and I doubt they had a massively robust engineering department in the same way that DICE would have done. So I think they probably had 3 projects that were ill-suited to Frostbite as they found it, made by an organization that is not known for its technical prowess. The most immediate thing that happened was the cancellation of Shadow Realms, which was cancelled with the stated reason being to provide more development resources for Mass Effect Andromeda and Dragon Age Inquisition. Now, going back through Kotaku's excellent reporting on the development troubles of Mass Effect Andromeda, it really is very clear how much Frostbite was a problem for both teams. I mean, when they first had to use it, Frostbite, it didn't have things like an inventory system, an RPG-compatible save system, and while it did have its own animation system, not really fit for purpose for a third-person action RPG. It also had things like limitations on the map size that were somewhat incompatible with the original design vision of Mass Effect Andromeda, which really was something that was incredibly ambitious. Now, what was even more of a problem is that BioWare's teams were kind of left scrambling. From reading it, I really think the teams were making their own features for their own purposes, for their own projects, but this sort of meant that even though Andromeda entered production after Dragon Age Inquisition, the Mass Effect team were not really able to benefit much from a technology share between the two teams, and that really negated one of the strengths of moving to Frostbite. Basically, it seems like loads of people were working on similar-ish systems across many different teams, and it seems like that was an inefficient allocation of resources from the development side. Then, of course, Frostbite was also mandated for Project Dylan, originally named as it was to be the Bob Dylan of video games, and of course eventually morphing into the Anthem, game that's in early access right now. It seems likely that this project also faced Frostbite-related problems. We do actually know that they were so far behind in development that Dragon Age's sequel, or Inquisition sequel, was paused to shift dev resources over to Anthem, which, again, that's something that could be dev-related. Now, one thing is for pretty certain, I would say. For a game that has been developed for so many years, Anthem seems to be fairly light on content. And of course, we do have the, many sort of reports of the development process being very challenging for that game. So on the whole, Frostbite caused a lot of damage to Inquisition, and it clearly was a large contributing factor to, well, part of the downfall of Mass Effect Andromeda, perhaps also causing problems for Dylan, being one of the core reasons why Shadow Realms was cancelled. Of course, it was also a contributing factor to the problems faced by Visceral's Ragtag project, the failure of which ultimately led to the studio's closure. So on the whole, while this Frostbite push was, I think, made for very sensible reasons, it does seem like it happened too early and they weren't ready for it. Maybe it would have made sense to spin off a technology group from DICE and have them spend a year or two making a robust engine and then only using it for future projects. But it doesn't seem to have happened, and to be honest, I can't really armchair this one anyway. Now, there are some decent examples of EA's ideal. As an example, Criterion were able to hop over to assist DICE on elements of Battlefront 2. And really, that could be a great example of, the benefits of everyone working on Frostbite. And that could be something that we'll see for future titles, but it does seem like the speed and maybe early state of the push led to significant damage for EA's core titles for really quite a few years, leading to Visceral going and all of the job losses that ensued, and really causing unnecessary hurdles for developers to overcome in other teams. One really wonders, how many people will they have lost to other studios and other organizations because of the problems caused by this, and has that led to a bleed in talent? So really, I don't think that the message of the coverage of this should really be that Frostbite is evil or a bad thing, or really that EA had bad intentions. Frostbite is, by all accounts, an amazing engine at what it does, and EA seem to have made this decision for, I think, fairly reasonable reasons. The thing is, they maybe implemented it too fast, at the cost of too much chaos to their teams, and that seems to have led to a fair amount of damage to their portfolio. I mean, hell, those cancelled Star Wars projects and the trouble they've had there. Maybe that's been another issue. But now that those initial projects are done with, I have to wonder, are we in a state where Frostbite now has its core tools, benefiting from Andromeda and from Anthem, and from the next Dragon Age game, I suppose, and will that mean that their future projects will be able to have a more smooth development process? It's kind of hard to know, it's just speculation, but I think that's essentially the core story of what Frostbite has done to EA Games, and I think a bit of the burn that it caused on their developers. So, let me know what you think about all this stuff down in the comments. I'd be super interested to hear, especially if you are involved in game engine stuff. I mean, I've only ever done it up to, the bounds of my university degree in terms of the hardcore, writing in C and stuff. Right now, I'm mainly just doing Unity scripting, so I definitely have lost a bit of perspective over time, and that's what I'd love to hear. But anyway, thank you very much for watching. I'll see you next time.